Bioactive enclosures. What are they? In my opinion, they are one of the best ways to recreate a small scale version of your reptile's natural habitat so that instead of just housing an animal, you are building a living system around it. Hey, I'm Clint with Crossstar Reptiles, and today I'm going to walk you through a complete bioactive enclosure build from start to finish. Now, this is not going to be a species specific setup. Depending on the animal that you have, your specific setup may vary a bit. So you'd have to do some research there to find out exactly what you need. But we're going to go through just a general bioactive enclosure build. And so what I'm showing you today is just the foundational build that can be adapted for a wide range of reptiles. And so again, a bioactive enclosure is more than just an enclosure with live plants added to it. At its core, a bioactive enclosure is a functioning ecosystem where biological processes help manage the waste. They help regulate your humidity and support just natural behaviors in your reptiles. And so a proper bioactive setup relies on putting some thought into your enclosure design, having layered substrates, and then beneficial microorganisms like temperate springtails or other isopods as a cleanup crew that do the work behind the scenes. Now, a bioactive enclosure is not a maintenance-free enclosure. But it kind of shifts the maintenance to where you still have to do spot cleans and things like that. But those microorganisms will very much help manage the waste, keep any smells down, things like that. Make sure you don't have mold building up, especially springtails. They are excellent at keeping mold out of your higher humidity enclosures. And so again, we need to start off by thinking what type of enclosure, because the enclosure itself kind of sets the ceiling for how successful your bioactive system is going to be. And so if the enclosure that you have doesn't provide enough ventilation or is not big enough or even small enough, depending on the animal that you have, those are not things that you can necessarily fix later. You may be able to add more ventilation, but making sure that you start off the right way, that your enclosure, if it's a custom build, or if it's a PVC enclosure or something like that, you want to make sure that that you have enough ventilation. You have to have that circulation of air in your enclosure. Around me here in part of my reptile room are these custom builds, and they have multiple ventilation points, and so that way, and even all of these here actually have a small PC fan that is mounted on the outside of at least one of the enclosure vents or the vent points to help circulate the air. So a good enclosure allows for that natural air movement, the natural movement of your animal. It's big enough to allow proper thermoregulation. One of the things, and I use ball pythons a lot because they are one of my favorite animals. They're what I have the most of. But a lot of people still believe that you can keep these animals as adults in a 40-gallon aquarium, and that drives me crazy because this animal, when it's full grown, is going to be somewhere around 4 feet or longer. And this is a female, so it's very possible that she gets even bigger. In a 40-gallon aquarium, that's not even big enough for this animal to fully stretch out. And so all of these enclosures are 4x2x2. And that is big enough to allow for proper thermoregulation. And then the substrate that I use is a mixture of cocoa fiber and sphagnum moss, and then some repti chip, loose leaf litter, things like that, so that it holds humidity very well and allows for stable humidity levels. And again, this is why I prefer PVC enclosures. I know that's not always possible, and aquariums can be a lot less expensive, but in the long run, that PVC enclosure, in my opinion, is going to do you is going to be much better for your reptile in the long run. And so, because I believe they just hold humidity and heat much more consistently than glass aquariums. Um, so the first thing with a bioactive enclosure, once you get your enclosure size, you have the right size enclosure established for your animal, you're going to want to start with a drainage layer. And what the drainage layer is it protects the rest of the system from excess moisture. Without a drainage layer, any water that you add to your substrate is just going to be held in that substrate. A drainage layer goes on the bottom, and it allows for that excess water to run down and then pool underneath your substrate. And then as your enclosure heats up, just like in a natural environment, the water beneath the substrate begins to evaporate. It comes back up through the substrate and then increases the humidity throughout your enclosure. The drainage layer that I recommend, that I typically use in all of my enclosures right here, are plastic aquarium dividers or plastic egg crates. The reason that I like them, you can stack them to get the proper depth. You can reuse them. So if you're moving from one enclosure to another or upgrading, they're reusable. They don't rot. Um, and they're less messy than something like a stone drainage layer or pebbles, or, you can use pebbles or gravel as long as it's been cleaned and not exposed to any kind of chemicals. Pumice stone is another good option. Um, but the plastic aquarium dividers, they're a lot less messy. They're much easier to use than those things, in my opinion. But without that drainage layer, as the water just accumulates in that substrate, it's going to lead to what's called an anaerobic condition. An anaerobic condition it just means that there's not enough oxygen in the soil because the water is just kind of taking up all the space. And so what happens then is the substrate, excuse me, the substrate stays waterlogged. Um, and any of your microorganisms, microbes that are in the soil are going to die off, because as the substrate is waterlogged, it's going to push all of the oxygen out. And then that's when harmful bacteria and mold and things like that can begin to flourish. So you have to make sure that you've got a good drainage layer. Because that imbalance is going to lead to unhealthy soil. Your plants are not going to survive, and then long-term problems are just going to endure in that enclosure. So after your drainage layer comes your substrate barrier, and that's just something like a landscaping fabric. So you put your drainage layer down, the aquarium dividers, or if you're using stone or gravel, you put that in the bottom. And over top of that, you're going to put your substrate barrier, your landscape or garden fabric. And that just keeps the soil from getting down into the gaps in those dividers or the stone. And so, because if you just put your substrate on top of the rock or the dividers, it's just going to get compacted down in there, and you're going to have the same problem. So you start with um, uh, uh, um, your water, your drainage layer. Sorry, my brain's not working. But you start with your drainage layer and then your substrate barrier, and that allows the water to pass through from the substrate down into the drainage layer. If you skip that, or if you don't do that, you're just going to end up with a compromised drainage layer. So drainage layer, substrate barrier, and then your substrate. Now, substrate isn't just dirt that you dump out of a bag, but what you're looking for is a medium that can support plants and microorganisms and invertebrates, isopods, while retaining moisture correctly. And so this kind of depends on the animal that you are housing. If you are housing a ball python, for example, again, I use a mix of cocoa fiber, sphagnum moss, and then cocoa chips on top of that, and leaf litter. The leaf litter provides a place for your isopods to stay, and they can feed off of that leaf litter as well. Um, but let's say you're doing a bioactive enclosure for something like a crocodile skink. You can still use the cocoa fiber with them, or you could use something like an organic topsoil and place in. If you're using it for an Accu monitor, for example, With them, I use a 2-to-1 ratio of organic topsoil and play sand because they like to burrow. And so that gives them a substrate that will hold their burrows and not collapse on them. So your substrate is going to depend on your animal, but you want to make sure that whatever substrate you use, that it can support your plant life, that it can support the microorganisms and isopods that you're going to hold, and then support your humidity and moisture correctly. Um, and with that, you've also got to make sure that the type of soil and the depth of that soil are correct, because the substrate needs to be able um, to hold roots. So if you're putting plants in all of my ball python enclosures, I have something like pothos plants or snake plants, some ferns, things like that. So the substrate has to allow for the gas exchange in that ecosystem as your plant and not your plant, but some plant matter and the waste begins to decay and is eaten. Then it releases the carbon dioxide is absorbed and the plants consume that. And then they produce oxygen as well, the whole process of photosynthesis. So and something to keep in mind there is if you do have living plants, is that you're going to have to provide them with something like a grow light so that they can have that proper photosynthesis process and that you can maintain a healthy ecosystem. And so once you have your drainage layer, your substrate barrier, and then your substrate, um, then you can add your cleanup crew. Your cleanup crew can be things like um, temperate springtails. That's what I use, and I raise those here. I actually have those for sale. If anybody would like those, you can reach out to me. I have quite a few temperate springtails, dairy cow isopods, and things like that. Um, I in all of my insect enclosures where I raise dubias or crickets and things like that, I use buffalo beetles as a cleanup crew. You can use mealworms because those they work well as a cleanup crew. I wouldn't necessarily put them in with a ball python, but I have those in my crocodile skink enclosure because then you are um, not just raising a cleanup crew, but you're also giving your animals something that they can naturally hunt. Um, so something like that would work well in like maybe a crested gecko enclosure or a crocodile skink enclosure, and they serve well as a cleanup crew. Now your cleanup crew is not going to eliminate all cleaning. You're still going to have to spot clean, but they will drastically reduce waste buildup because they're not just going to eat your animal's waste, but like when they shed, they're going to eat that shed skin. And with springtails, if there's any mold, they very quickly will consume the mold in the enclosure. Um, so once you have your drainage layer, substrate barrier, substrate, um, before you add your cleanup crew in, you're going to make sure whatever your hardscape is, like your logs or your cork bark or branches, things like that. If you're doing, a lot of people with bioactive builds like to use great stuff, spray foam, to hold their bark or their branches in, and then you can carve that out to make a very nice looking enclosure. So you're going to want to do that if you're using especially spray foam. You're going to want to do that before you do anything else. That would be the very first thing. So again, you want to make sure that you have your enclosure planned out well in advance, and with whatever hardscape and things that you're going to use, especially if you're going to be adding heavy branches. You want to make sure that those are secure in your enclosure. You don't want a real heavy log in there that is able to fall over because then it may, it could injure your reptile if it's a very heavy log, especially if it's a smaller, gecko species or lizard species or something like that. Um, so, again, depending on your reptile, you're going to want to use logs or branches, cork bark, rocks, and different hides, climbing opportunities, things like that, shelters, so that you can give them what they need in their enclosure. Um, excuse me again. And then live plants. Live plants do more than just make your enclosure look pretty. They help regulate humidity and stabilize your substrate. They improve the air quality, and they contribute to the overall success and balance of your system. But you need to take into account what type of plant you're using and what type of reptile you have. Because there are some plants that you could include in like a ball python enclosure that you couldn't put into, say, something like a tortoise enclosure, because that plant may be toxic to a tortoise. And with most tortoises, if it's green, they're going to bite it. So you want to make sure that whatever plants that you are using are non-toxic. Um, so that requires some research and again planning in advance before you just put it in the enclosure. Also take into consideration the lighting requirements, humidity, and then the natural behavior of the animal. Um, with ball pythons, I almost solely use pothos plants and snake plants because they are so heavy and big bodied that they are going to crush the plants. So pothos plants are very resilient, so that even if they're being laid on quite a bit and pushed down, they are going to continue to come back and not cause you any, having to replace plants all that often. Whereas if you use a more fragile plant, you can pretty much consider that plant dead with a ball python. Not every plant works in every setup. Um, and so some of the more commonly used reptile safe plants would be pothos, snake plants, different types of ferns and mini ferns, philodendrons, and spider plants. They tend to be hardy, non-toxic, and adaptable to a wide range of lighting and humidity conditions. Now, for my Ackie monitors, I use some buffalo grass because it's very accustomed to arid conditions, and so their enclosures get very hot during the day, especially around their basking sites. So, take that into consideration as well, and make sure that whatever lighting and heat you establish is going to be for the best for the environmental foundation of the enclosure. Make sure you have your proper heat gradients for your reptiles. So that they can thermoregulate instead of being locked into a simple or a single temperature zone. Ball pythons and reptiles in general are cold blooded, so they can't regulate their own body temperature. So they will move from the hot side to the cold side of your enclosure. If they get too warm, they can move to the cool side. And when they get too cool, they can move back to the warm side. And that is just a natural behavior for these animals. So you've got to make sure that you provide that for them. And then when required, UVB lighting. That may be something more for an overall reptile build. But UVB is important depending on the reptile that you have. Ball pythons don't necessarily need UVB, but research has shown that they can benefit from low-level UVB. But in general, UVB supports calcium metabolism overall. And so with especially reptiles like bearded dragons or your Ackie monitors, other monitor species, they need UVB. And with my Ackies, they have to have a very high output UVB. And I like to say this anytime I'm talking about heat and lighting, but make sure every heat source that you have is connected to a thermostat to prevent your animal from getting burned or from it getting too hot in the enclosure. And something to remember about bioactive enclosures is that they thrive on balance and not constant adjustment. There is no such thing as a set it and forget it enclosure, but with a bioactive enclosure, you're wanting it to be consistent. So you're going to need the right substrate depth. You're talking probably, I would say, a minimum of 4 inches of substrate to get the right depth. You're going to want to cover it with some kind of leaf litter to give your springtails and isopods a place where they can hide and that they can, have that leaf litter to consume as well. You're going to want to make sure that you're adding water into the corners of your enclosure, not misting constantly with ball pythons. Now, something like geckos, you're going to have to mist that, or chameleons. They need to be misted pretty regularly. But with ball pythons, at least you can add your water directly to the corners of your substrate, and then that water will drain down through and then collect in the bottom. And make sure that you have proper ventilation. And the goal again is stability and not constant correction. Um, One of the most important things with a bioactive enclosure is giving it time to establish, or something called cycling. Cycling allows the roots of your enclosure to take root. It allows the microorganisms to colonize, and then it gives your cleanup crews time to settle in to the system. Now, during that process, you're going to have to add something in for your cleanup crews to consume. In the cycling process. So you could take something like some yeast and put it in there, and it will begin to mold. And that's okay, because your temperate springtails will consume that very quickly. But they have to have something that they can eat until you add your animal in, and then they begin to add the waste in there. Then that will give those microorganisms the food that they need. But if you rush that cycling process, that's probably one of the most common reasons why bioactive enclosures fail, because we rush, we want to get things done, so we get the plants in, we get our springtails in, and then we put our animal in, and then we wonder why the plants are dying and why why the bioactive enclosure is not working. It takes time. In general, you're probably going to want your bioactive enclosure ready 6 weeks or so before you add your animal to it, because that will give your plants time to take root and to grow. It will give time for your springtails and your isopods to colonize. And then your animals should only be introduced once your temperature and humidity and lighting are all stable. And so that 6-week period also gives you time to monitor and adjust. Let's say you're using a ceramic heat emitter in your enclosure, and it's connected to a thermostat. Well, your thermostat, you may set it, let's say, at 86 degrees. With ball pythons, I'm going to use them for an example. Their temperature gradient should be 86 to 88, and no more than 90 on the warm side, and then 75 to 80 degrees on the cool side. Well, let's say you set your thermostat at 86, and then you have a thermometer inside your enclosure, and you notice your thermometer is not getting above 80. Well, then you may need to turn your thermostat up. Just because your thermostat is set at 86 doesn't mean it's actually going to get 86 degrees in your enclosure. And so the way to measure that is using digital thermometers, and I would recommend an infrared temperature gun that you can check that temperature with in various spots in your enclosure to make sure that you have the right temperature gradient. On the other hand, let's say you set it at 86 degrees and you notice that it's getting 95, especially near that ceramic heat emitter, because that ceramic heat emitter, even though your thermostat's set at 88, that bulb is going to get, up to 200 degrees. And so it's going to be emanating heat, for a little while, even after the thermostat cuts off. So then you may have to turn the temperature down on your thermostat to get the temperature correct at your different thermometer points. And so that's something that in that 6-week period, you can maintain and adjust and dial in before you add your animal. And when you add your animal, or if you add your animal too soon, then it destabilizes the enclosure and it's not ready to support life long term. And throughout the process, bioactive enclosures still require close observation and care. You may need to trim plants. I don't think you can see it in this, but actually my ball python enclosure up here, one of my pothos plants actually has leaves that are growing out of just a very tiny crack where the glass meets the side of the enclosure, and it has found a gap, and there's just a leaf that has grown out of that. So I've got to trim that back. You're going to have to look at your cleanup crew populations. You may have to add springtails. The great thing about temperate springtails is they tend to maintain their colony size on their own. So if they get too many and they start to recognize that there's not enough food for all of them, then they will actually begin to consume some of those other springtails, and they'll die off a bit. They're very good at maintaining their colony size, but you may need to add some from time to time. You may need to add more isopods, or you may need to remove isopods. Um, spot cleaning still part of the process. So those are just things that you have to keep up with. But over time, a properly built bioactive enclosure becomes easier to maintain as the system matures. Um, and really, most bioactive enclosures fail because we cut corners. We rush adding our animals in. We don't have the right drainage layer. We chose the wrong enclosure from the start. Um, but if you take your time and you do things right, in my opinion, bioactive enclosures are the way to go. And they're a great reward for patience and planning when they're done correctly. And they will work with your animal instead of against the animal. And that is the approach that we use in all of our enclosures here at Crossstar Reptiles. If you have any questions about a bioactive build, I actually have about a 40-page booklet that I have written on building a bioactive enclosure with different pictures and things from start to beginning, or from beginning to end rather. That I would be happy to give you if you'll subscribe to our channel, like this video, comment, and tell me that you would like that. Give me your email address, and I will send that out to you for no charge, just because I want people to have the right information when it comes to these bioactive enclosures. If you have any questions about different reptile species or breeds or care guides, things like that, let me know as well. Again, for anybody that subscribes to our channel and would comment and let me know what you want, then I would get that out to you at no cost. And again, because my goal here is just proper education for all of these wonderful reptiles that we love so much, so that they have the very best care possible. And so again, this is Clint with Crossstar Reptiles, and we're just getting started.